The rubber sole of my sneaker squeaked against the freshly waxed linoleum, a sound that echoed like a solitary gunshot in the cavernous silence of the Northwood High corridor. It was exactly 10:14 in the morning, 6 minutes into third period, and the hallway stretched out before me like a sterile, beige tunnel aimed directly at a future I was desperately trying to navigate without collision. I was not skipping class. I was not loitering with intent. I was clutching a laminated hall pass, damp and warm from the nervous sweat of my palm, which explicitly authorized a trip to the guidance counselor's office to discuss advanced placement scheduling. But authorization is often a fickle concept when you fit a specific description in a school district that prioritizes statistical order over individual understanding. That was the moment the shadow detached itself from the bank of locker bays near the water fountain. It did not move with the casual gait of a teacher or the hurried pace of a student. It moved with the predatory stillness of authority. Officer Miller stepped into the precise center of the walkway, effectively blocking out the light from the exit sign behind him, his silhouette cutting a jagged line through the fluorescent hum of the building. He did not speak immediately. He simply stood there, a physical embodiment of a boundary line I was terrified to cross. The air in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees, shifting from the stale warmth of a heating system to the cold metallic atmosphere of an interrogation room. I could smell him from 10 feet away, a distinct mixture of harsh laundry detergent, stale coffee, and the unmistakable scent of gun oil that seemed to cling to the heavy utility belt resting on his hips. My heart hammered against my ribcage, not out of guilt, but out of a conditioned reflex honed by years of cautionary tales whispered at the dinner table. This was the talk my father had given me 1,000 times, manifested in real time. Keep your hands visible. Regulate your breathing. Do not run. Do not argue. Survive the interaction. As I slowed my pace, bringing my momentum to a respectful halt 5 feet from his polished boots, I felt a vibration against my right thigh. It was my phone. A silent, rhythmic pulsing that usually signaled a text message or a social media notification, but today, in this precise second of suspended animation, it represented something far more powerful. It was the live location beacon I had activated before leaving Mr. Henderson's history class. Officer Miller's eyes were hidden behind tinted tactical shades, an absurdity indoors, yet a calculated choice to prevent me from reading his intentions. He shifted his weight, the leather of his holster creaking, a sound designed to remind me of the disparity in our respective power dynamics. "Where are you supposed to be, son?" he asked. The word son rolled off his tongue not as a term of endearment, but as a diminutive, a way to reduce my 18 years of academic discipline and athletic excellence into a chaotic variable that needed to be managed. His hand rested casually near his radio, fingers twitching slightly, ready to escalate a quiet transit into a disciplinary event. I swallowed the lump of dry fear in my throat, forcing my voice to remain in the lower register, calm and devoid of the tremors shaking my knees. "Guidance," I said, slowly lifting the orange pass to eye level. "I have an appointment." He didn't look at the pass. He looked at me. He looked through me, scanning for the microaggressions, the attitude, the spark of rebellion that would justify detention, suspension, or worse. The silence stretched, elastic and suffocating. In that silence, I realized the terrifying truth of the American school system for students like me. I was not a scholar here. I was a suspect. The architecture of the school, with its cameras and locked doors and armed guards, was not designed to keep the world out, but to keep us in check. And unknown to him, the device in my pocket was logging every second of this standoff. It was recording the latitude, the longitude, and the duration of my stoppage. It was building a digital receipt of harassment in a place that claimed to be a sanctuary of learning. The officer took a step forward, invading my personal space, his imposing frame casting a shadow over my face. "You don't look like you're heading to guidance," he murmured, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that made my skin crawl. "You look like you're looking for trouble." The irony was sharp enough to cut glass. I was the captain of the debate team. I had a 4.2 GPA. I had never even served a detention. Yet, in this hallway, stripped of my resume and judged solely by the optics of my existence, I was the enemy. The vibration in my pocket stopped, implying the signal had locked onto the satellite. The data was live. The evidence was streaming. He thought he was the one conducting surveillance, watching a potential delinquent drift through the halls. He had no idea that the surveillance was reversed. The watched was watching the watcher. And as his hand moved from his radio to the notepad in his breast pocket, signaling the beginning of a write-up that could derail my college applications, I knew that this wasn't just a hallway encounter. This was the opening move in a game of chess I had been preparing for my entire life, and I had just brought a queen to a knife fight. The sharp metallic click of a ballpoint pen engaging can sound remarkably like the racking of a slide on a firearm when the acoustics of a deserted high school corridor amplify the silence between two opposing forces. I watched the officer's thumb depress the plunger of his tactical pen, a small movement that signaled the shift from observation to documentation. In that suspended second, the physics of the hallway seemed to change, the air growing heavier with the invisible particulate matter of accusation. He looked down at his notepad, breaking eye contact to focus on the bureaucracy of discipline, effectively erasing my humanity to replace it with a case number and a description of a suspicious male loitering during instructional hours. This moment, right here, was the physical manifestation of the black tax. It is a concept often discussed in economic terms, referring to the financial support successful professionals provide to extended families, but there is a far more insidious currency in play within the walls of American institutions. This tax is the cognitive overhead required to navigate spaces where your presence is questioned by default. It is the energy expenditure of constantly calculating how you are being perceived, the metabolic cost of suppressing your natural fight-or-flight response to appear non-threatening, and the time stolen from your education to defend your right to receive it. While my peers in the AP Calculus class down the hall were currently spending their mental energy on derivatives and integrals, I was forced to spend mine on de-escalation and survival. That is the tax. It is the extra 10%, the added weight in the rucksack, the friction coefficient that slows down upward mobility just enough to make the climb exhausting. I stood perfectly still, hands visible, posture submissive yet dignified, a balance I had rehearsed in front of a mirror until it felt less like acting and more like armor. The officer began to write, the scratching of ink on paper echoing like a whispered indictment. He assumed I was nervous about detention, about a phone call home, or perhaps about the suspension that accompanies insubordination. He was operating on a standard frequency, reading from a script that had been written decades ago for interactions between authority and perceived deviance. He did not know that I was operating on a completely different frequency, one tuned to a lesson plan drafted at a kitchen table by a father who knew that excellence alone was not a sufficient shield. This encounter was not a random accident of timing. It was the inevitable collision course predicted by the 3 pillars of survival I had been taught since I was tall enough to reach the door handle. These were the open loops of my upbringing, the 3 specific stories that formed the architecture of my defense. We call them the defense of excellence, the art of the code switch, and the receipt generation. As the officer looked up, expecting to see a teenager crumbling under the weight of authority, he instead found a young man analyzing the geometry of the situation. I was thinking about the live data packet currently bouncing off a satellite and landing on a secure server my father monitored. The black tax dictates that in a battle of Hezachasade, my voice holds a lower market value. My word is subject to inflation and depreciation based on the listener's bias. Therefore, I could not afford to rely on the currency of my word. I needed the gold standard of raw data. The tension in the air was palpable, a static charge building before a lightning strike, but the fear I should have felt was replaced by a cold, clinical observation. I was paying the tax in this moment, certainly, losing precious minutes of my lunch break, spiking my cortisol levels, enduring the humiliation of being treated like a suspect in the school where I held the highest GPA, but I was also preparing to file for a refund. He tapped the pen against the paper, a rhythmic intimidation tactic designed to induce a confession or a stuttered apology. "Where are you supposed to be, son?" he asked, the word son doing a lot of heavy lifting, dripping with a paternal condescension that barely masked the aggression beneath. It was a trap question. If I answered with attitude, I was aggressive. If I mumbled, I was guilty. If I stayed silent, I was non-compliant. This was the labyrinth where the tax is collected, where every turn leads to a penalty fee. But I had the map. I knew that this interaction was merely the surface level of a much deeper game, one that I intended to win not by fighting, but by revealing the board itself. The open loop was closing. The lessons were activating. And as I opened my mouth to speak, utilizing the precise tone and cadence required to disarm him without surrendering my dignity, I realized that the true tragedy wasn't that I had to learn these skills, but that they were the most valuable education I would receive in this building. The fluorescent hum of the hallway lights seemed to drop an octave, vibrating against the base of my skull as the school resource officer shifted his weight from one tactical boot to the other. Dust motes danced in the singular beam of sunlight cutting through the reinforced safety glass of the exit doors, illuminating the microscopic gap between his authority and my autonomy. This was the moment the training kicked in, the instant where the abstract concept of the defense of excellence had to be transmuted into a physical shield. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, but my face remained a mask of practiced indifference, a smooth porcelain surface that offered no friction for his hostility to latch onto. He had asked me where I was coming from, a question that was not an inquiry but an accusation wrapped in the syntax of curiosity. To answer casually was to invite disrespect. To answer aggressively was to invite handcuffs. The only path through the minefield was the path of unassailable, overwhelming competence. I adjusted the strap of my backpack, ensuring the movement was slow, deliberate, and entirely visible, telegraphing that I held no weapons, only textbooks that cost more than the shoes he was wearing. The air smelled faintly of floor wax and stale cafeteria pizza, a banal backdrop for a high-stakes negotiation of civil liberty. I engaged the first protocol of the defense of excellence, the weaponization of vocabulary. When I spoke, I stripped every trace of regional dialect, slang, or teenage cadence from my voice. I adopted the sterile, precise diction of a nightly news anchor or a junior associate at a law firm. I informed him that I was transitioning from AP Calculus to the Honors Humanities seminar, specifically citing the room numbers and the names of the instructors. I did not say I was walking to class. I said I was transiting between authorized educational zones. The effect was immediate and disjointing. He blinked, the script in his head fracturing. He had been prepared for defiance, for a mumble, for a reason to escalate his volume and assert dominance. He was not prepared for a syllabus. This is the burden of the defense of excellence. It requires a teenager to possess the emotional regulation of a diplomat and the verbal precision of a litigator simply to walk down a hallway without being detained. It is an exhausting performance, a constant audition for the right to exist in a space that was ostensibly built for my benefit. I watched his eyes scan me, looking for a loose thread, a violation of the dress code, a hint of insubordination, anything to re-establish the hierarchy that my diction had just leveled. But the defense of excellence is not merely about how one speaks, it is about the receipts one keeps. This is where the digital age has altered the landscape of these interactions, turning the surveillance state back upon itself. He pressed harder, suggesting that I matched the description of someone reported for loitering near the gym, a vague catch-all accusation designed to fish for guilt. This was the trap. In the old world, it would be his word against mine, and his badge weighed heavier than my truth. But I had the ultimate alibi, the technological extension of my excellence. I slowly retrieved my phone, narrating the action before I took it, and unlocked the screen to display my timeline. I didn't just show him a clock, I showed him the metadata of my existence. I pulled up the live location history, a digital breadcrumb trail that proved with satellite precision that I had been seated in the library for the last 45 minutes, nowhere near the gymnasium. The blue dot on the screen pulsed, a silent heartbeat of objective truth that cut through his subjective suspicion. There is a profound and specific tragedy in the fact that I, a 16-year-old student, felt compelled to track my own movements with the rigor of a parolee, anticipating this exact moment. I had curated my digital footprint not for social media clout, but as an insurance policy against the assumptions of men with badges. The officer looked at the screen, then at me. The data was irrefutable. The defense of excellence had held. I saw the aggression drain out of his posture, replaced by a sullen confusion. He had been defeated not by force, but by a superior command of the facts. He muttered a dismissal, A half-hearted wave of the hand that meant I was free to go, but there was no apology. There never is. The defense of excellence does not yield apologies, it only yields survival. As I walked away, the adrenaline finally began to recede, leaving a metallic taste in my mouth. I had won the interaction, but the victory felt hollow. I realized that the true tax wasn't just the fear of the encounter, it was the energy required to maintain the armor. I had to be a model citizen, a data analyst, and a lawyer just to get to my next class, while my peers could simply be children. The hallway stretched out before me, long and empty, and for the first time, I felt the heavy, crushing weight of my own excellence. The double doors to the cafeteria swung open, hitting the magnetic stoppers with a dull clank that was immediately swallowed by the roar of 300 unsupervised adolescents. The air inside was thick and humid, carrying the scent of industrial pepperoni pizza, floor wax, and the distinct metallic tang of teenage anxiety masking as bravado. To anyone else, this cacophony was just the sound of lunch period, a chaotic symphony of social hierarchy and decompression. To me, however, it was a minefield of frequencies that required immediate and precise audio engineering. This brings us to the second pillar of survival, a mechanism I came to call the internal volume knob. If the defense of excellence is the shield, the internal volume knob is the camouflage. It is the exhausting manual labor of constantly modulating one's own humanity to fit within the narrow bandwidth of safety allowed to students who look like me. As I stepped across the threshold, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, a physical manifestation of my hand reaching for that mental dial and turning it down. Down from the exuberance of youth, down from the volume of my natural voice, down to a hum that would register as non-threatening on the radar of the resource officer standing by the vending machines. I moved through the lunch line, gripping a plastic tray that was still wet from the dishwasher. Around me, the privilege of volume was on full display. A group of boys at the center table were shouting, shoving each other in a mock brawl that sent a carton of milk flying across the linoleum. They laughed, loud and raucous, their joy taking up space, their aggression read by the adults in the room as harmless play. I watched the officer by the wall. He did not flinch. He did not reach for his radio. He saw boys being boys. But I knew, with the certainty of a data analyst reading a trendline, that if I were to raise my voice to that decibel, if I were to shove a friend in jest, the interpretation would be radically different. My volume would not be read as play, it would be read as a disturbance. My laughter would not be seen as joy, it would be seen as loitering. My aggression would not be boys being boys, it would be a precursor to a riot. And so, I calibrated. I smoothed my expression into a mask of benign indifference. I walked with a gait that was purposeful but not hurried, shrinking my physical footprint until I was merely a shadow passing through the noise. This modulation goes beyond mere volume, it is a suppression of the autonomic nervous system. Halfway to my table, a student rushing to join the food fight collided with me, his shoulder driving hard into my ribs. The impact was sharp, shocking. My tray clattered, the silverware sliding ominously. My immediate, biological instinct, the instinct of any human being with a pulse, was to shout, to shove back, to demand an apology, to flare up in righteous indignation. The adrenaline spiked, the fight-or-flight response screaming for release. But in the microsecond between the impact and my reaction, the internal volume knob kicked in. It overrode millions of years of evolution. I caught the flash of the officer's eyes shifting toward the commotion. I saw the phone in the other student's hand, the camera lens a black unblinking eye that could broadcast my reaction to the world in real time, stripping away context and leaving only the image of an angry black youth. The live location of my body was not just a dot on a GPS map, it was a coordinate on a threat grid. I swallowed the anger. I forced my posture to slump slightly, making myself smaller, less imposing. I dialed my voice down to a sub-frequency, a tone of deferential softness that scraped against my vocal cords. "No problem," I said, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "My bad. I apologized for being hit. I apologized for occupying the space that someone else had invaded." The other student didn't even stop, just kept running toward his friends, unburdened by the weight of having to manage his own optics. I bent down to pick up a fork, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. This is the hidden tax of the internal volume knob. It creates a dissonance between the storm inside and the calm outside. It requires you to be a diplomat in a war zone where you are the only one who knows the treaty has been signed. The truly shocking truth revealed by modern surveillance and the reality of live location tracking is that this volume knob can never be turned off. We used to think that we only had to code switch when the officer was in the room, when the blue uniform was visible in the periphery. But the digital age has expanded the panopticon. The knowledge that any interaction can be filmed, clipped, and uploaded means that the audience is permanent. The officer is always watching, even when he isn't there. The internal volume must remain permanently suppressed, the treble of our emotions cut, the bass of our presence minimized, until we become experts at being present without being felt. I sat down at an empty table, the noise of the cafeteria swirling around me like a cyclone, and sat in a silence so loud it made my ears ring. The sanctuary I sought was not found in the chaotic din of the cafeteria, but in the quiet, dust-mote-filled air of room 304, where the smell of cedar shavings and dry paper created a fortress against the modern world. It was the domain of Mr. Vance, a history teacher whose tenure at the high school predated the installation of the metal detectors, the security cameras, and certainly the digital surveillance apps that now tracked our movements like migratory birds. I stood in the doorway, the heavy oak frame feeling less like an entrance and more like a portal between two distinct eras of vigilance. Inside, the afternoon light filtered through yellowed blinds, painting stripes across rows of empty desks that seemed to vibrate with the echoes of thousands of students who had sat there before me, learning how to navigate a world that often refused to see them clearly. Mr. Vance sat at his desk, a monolith of a man whose skin carried the deep, rich patina of polished mahogany. His silver hair cropped close in a style that spoke of military discipline and undeniable dignity. He did not look up immediately when I entered, his attention focused on a stack of essays that he marked with the precision of a surgeon, his fountain pen scratching a rhythmic cadence against the silence. It was a deliberate pause, I realized, a moment he offered to let my heart rate decelerate from the panic of the hallway encounter. When he finally raised his eyes, magnified slightly behind tortoiseshell frames, there was no interrogation in his gaze, only a profound and weary recognition. He gestured to the chair beside his desk, a wooden seat worn smooth by generations of students who had come to him seeking an explanation for the unexplainable physics of our social existence. I sat down and placed my phone on his desk, the screen still glowing with the interface of the safety app, the blue dot pulsing my live location to the school resource officer's dashboard. The technology was sold to our parents as a shield, a way to ensure rapid response in emergencies, but in the hands of the administration, it felt more like a shackle. I told him about the encounter in the hallway, about the way the officer had cited my location history as probable cause for suspicion, turning my daily routine into a map of potential delinquency. I expected Mr. Vance to be shocked by the digital intrusion, by the way our privacy had been strip-mined for data. Instead, a slow, melancholic smile touched the corners of his mouth, and he leaned back, clasping his hands over his vest. He told me that I was making the mistake of thinking this was new. He spoke in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder, explaining that the technology had changed, certainly, but the architecture of the interaction remained ancient. He reached into the drawer of his desk and pulled out not a tablet, but a tattered, green-covered guidebook from the mid-20th century. He placed it next to my sleek smartphone, the juxtaposition jarring. This, he explained, was the analog version of my live location app. For his father, and his father's father, survival depended on knowing exactly where they could and could not be after sunset. The map wasn't digital then, it was mental, etched into the psyche through stories whispered at dinner tables and warnings shouted from passing cars. The shocking truth he revealed was not about the software, but about the continuity of the gaze. He explained that the live location tracking was merely the automation of the overseer, a way to scale the sensation of being watched without the expense of human labor. In his day, he said, the police didn't need GPS because the community boundaries served as the invisible fence. If you crossed the wrong street, you were effectively pinging your location to a hostile network. He described the visceral memory of walking past a patrol car in 1968, the way his own internal volume knob had to be turned down just as mine was today. He talked about the black tax, not just as an economic burden, but as an emotional tariff, the energy required to constantly broadcast your own harmlessness. We sat there as the sun dipped lower, the shadows lengthening across the linoleum floor, and he drew a direct line from the patrol logs of the past to the server logs of the present. The screen of my phone dimmed and went black, reflecting our faces side by side, one young and terrified, one old and weathered, both caught in the same systemic web, separated only by time. He told me that the officer's power didn't come from the badge or the gun, or even the app. It came from the assumption that our bodies were public property, subject to audit at any moment. The mentor did not offer me a solution to disable the tracking, for he knew that was impossible. Instead, he offered me the perspective of endurance. He taught me that the goal of this constant surveillance was to make us police ourselves, to make us shrink until we fit into the boxes they designed. His lesson was the counter-narrative I needed, that existing loudly, brilliantly, and without fear, despite the tracking, was the ultimate act of rebellion. As I listened, the isolation of the cafeteria faded, replaced by the heavy, comforting weight of a baton being passed. I wasn't just a dot on a screen, I was the latest chapter in a very long book. The administrative suite smelled of stale coffee and the quiet, suffocating dampness of impending judgment, a distinct olfactory cocktail that every student knows but few ever truly get used to. I sat in a plastic chair that was bolted to the floor, a subtle architectural choice designed to remind me that even my posture was subject to regulation. Across the desk sat the principal, a man whose face was a roadmap of bureaucratic fatigue, and standing by the window was Officer Miller, the school resource officer who had initiated this entire ordeal. The silence in the room was heavy, thick enough to choke on, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock that seemed to be counting down the seconds of my future. This was the moment the tension had been building toward, the inevitable collision between the narrative they had constructed about me and the reality I actually lived. The accusation was serious, a vague yet dangerous claim about my involvement in a disturbance behind the gymnasium during fourth period, a time when the hallways were empty and the cameras were conveniently pointed elsewhere. Officer Miller held a tablet in his hand, his knuckles white, confident in the digital leash he believed he held over the student body. He claimed that his instinct, backed by a ping on the location monitoring system, placed me at the scene of the crime. It was the trap the mentor had warned me about, the weaponization of our presence. But what Officer Miller did not understand, and what the principal had failed to consider, was that the surveillance state works both ways. If I was being watched, I made sure I was also recording. I reached into my bag, the movement slow and deliberate, telegraphing that I was not a threat but a participant in this procedural dance. I pulled out my own device, a cracked smartphone that contained the digital archive of my existence. This was the essence of the fourth pillar, the receipts. In a world where my word would always be weighed against a badge, data was the only currency that held its value. I placed the phone on the desk, the screen illuminating the dim room with a harsh, blue light. I did not raise my voice. I did not plead or beg, for dignity does not beg. Instead, I opened the timeline. The counter-storytelling framework I had internalized taught me that they expected an emotional reaction, a chaotic defense that they could dismiss as guilt. Instead, I gave them cold, hard metadata. I pulled up the very app they used to track us, the same system Officer Miller was relying on, but I overlaid it with the timestamps from the school's own library login system. The receipts were irrefutable. At the exact moment the disturbance was occurring behind the gym, my digital footprint showed I was logged into a library terminal on the other side of the campus, researching history for an AP project. The GPS coordinates on my phone, cross-referenced with the library's IP address, created an alibi so airtight it sucked the oxygen out of their accusation. The shift in the room was palpable, a sudden drop in barometric pressure as the power dynamic inverted. Officer Miller leaned in, squinting at the screen, his confidence eroding into confusion. He swiped at his own tablet, looking for a glitch, a loophole, anything to maintain the narrative of my guilt. But the numbers did not lie. The shocking truth wasn't just that I was innocent, it was that their own system, designed to entrap and monitor, had inadvertently become the tool of my exoneration. I watched the principal's eyes dart from the officer to the phone and finally to me. There was no apology in his gaze, only a calculating reassessment. He realized that I was not merely a body to be managed, but a mind that had mastered the rules of their game better than they had. This was the moral victory. It wasn't about getting the officer fired or dismantling the system in a single afternoon. That was a fantasy. The victory was in the silence that followed, the realization that I had forced them to acknowledge my humanity through the language of their own bureaucracy. I explained, with a calm that unnerved them, that I kept my own logs precisely because I knew this day would come. I detailed the steps of my day, matching each movement to a data point on the screen. I stripped away the vague menace of the officer's intuition and replaced it with the undeniable clarity of facts. The defense of excellence I had cultivated was not just about grades or behavior, it was about administrative competence. I saw the officer holster his tablet, a subtle gesture of surrender. He muttered something about a technical error, a glitch in the live location feed, a face-saving retreat that acknowledged his defeat without admitting fault. It didn't matter. The room felt different now. The smell of stale coffee was still there, but the suffocating weight had lifted. I stood up, retrieving my phone, my shield, my witness, and placed it back in my pocket. As I walked toward the door, I didn't look back. I didn't need to see their faces to know that the dynamic had shifted. I walked out of that office not as a suspect, but as a victor in a quiet, invisible war. The receipts were filed, the open loop was closed, and I stepped back into the hallway, the noise of the changing period washing over me like a chaotic, beautiful applause. The heavy metal doors of the West Wing swung shut behind me with a finality that echoed louder than the dismissal bell, severing the cool, conditioned air of the institution from the humid warmth of the afternoon. I stepped out onto the concrete steps, the sunlight blinding me momentarily, forcing a squint that felt less like a reaction to the glare and more like a recalibration of my entire worldview. The adrenaline that had sustained me in that cramped office, the chemical focus that allowed me to present my digital evidence with the precision of a seasoned litigator, began to recede, leaving in its wake a profound, hollow exhaustion. It was not the exhaustion of physical labor, but the deep spiritual fatigue that comes from having to justify your existence in a space that was ostensibly designed to nurture it. I walked toward the edge of the campus, past the manicured hedges and the statues of founders who would likely have viewed me with the same suspicion as the officer inside, and I realized that the victory I had just secured was Pyrrhic. I had won the battle, certainly. The receipts were undeniable, the location data irrefutable, and the apology, however mumbled, was recorded in the shift of power that occurred in that room. Yet, as I watched other students laughing in clusters, worrying about prom dates and calculus exams, I understood the true cost of the black tax. While they were allowed the luxury of unbridled adolescence, I had been forced to become a paralegal in my own defense, a curator of my own movements, perpetually preparing for an indictment that could arrive at any moment. This was the final lesson, the one that wasn't written on any syllabus or captured in the standardized tests that determined our academic worth. The lesson was that innocence is not a passive state of being for people who look like me. It is an active, rigorous construction project. I had to build my innocence brick by brick, data point by data point, timestamp by timestamp. The counter-storytelling framework I had employed was not merely a rhetorical device, it was a survival mechanism. The officer had entered that room with a story already written in his mind, a narrative arc where I was the antagonist, the disruptor, the problem to be solved. His story relied on the lazy shorthand of stereotypes and the assumed authority of his badge. My counter-story, the one that dismantled his, relied on the cold, hard specificity of truth. It was a story told through the metadata of my life, a digital trail that proved I was studying in the library when he claimed I was elsewhere. This experience crystallized the realization that we cannot afford to leave our stories in the hands of others, for their drafts will always be tragedies where we are the ones who fall. I reached the bus stop and sat on the weathered bench, the plastic warm against my back, and pulled my phone out once more. The screen, now just a slab of glass reflecting the passing cars, had been my shield. It was strange to think that this device, often criticized as a distraction or a vice of my generation, had served as the only objective witness in a room full of biased eyes. The open loop of the interrogation had been closed, but a new loop had opened in my psyche. I now understood that excellence, the kind I displayed in class, the grades, the deportment, was not a shield against suspicion, but merely the table stakes required to even be heard. The pillars we had discussed, the defense of excellence and the receipts, were not abstract concepts but tangible armor. I looked down at my hands. They were steady now, no longer trembling with the suppressed rage of the falsely accused. There was a dignity in that steadiness, a quiet resolve that felt permanent. I had looked into the machinery of the system, saw the gears grinding toward my erasure, and I had jammed a wrench into the works. As the bus pulled up, hissing its hydraulic greeting, I boarded not as the scared kid who had walked into the principal's office an hour ago, but as an archivist of my own reality. The passengers around me saw a student in a backpack, likely tired from a long day of learning. They could not see the invisible war I had just fought, nor the invisible medal of honor I now wore. The officer would go home to his dinner, perhaps frustrated by the technical glitch he blamed for his error, and likely forget my face by next week. But I would remember. I would remember that the truth is only as powerful as your ability to prove it. As the bus lurched forward, merging into the traffic of the city, I watched the school recede into the distance, shrinking until it was just another building on the skyline. I had survived the interaction, I had exposed the shocking truth of their presumption, and in doing so, I had graduated to a level of consciousness that no diploma could ever confer. The silence in my head was no longer heavy. It was spacious, filled with the clarity of someone who knows exactly who they are and, more importantly, knows exactly what they are up against.